I think I'm just less of a materialist than that to begin with. I think our politics is, in some sense, always about which team you want to understand yourself to be a part of. Who's the we? And the thing that can't go on is that both parties are answering that question in a way that leaves them as minorities. The striking thing about this moment in American politics, and I mean the past generations, the past 30 years, is that both of our parties are minority parties at the same time. That's very unusual in American politics. Almost any moment you look in on our politics, you'd find a majority party struggling to keep together a really complicated coalition and a minority party that defines itself against the majority. There was one period at the end of the 19th century that didn't look like that. And now we're living in another period that doesn't look like that, and that for 30 years has not looked like that. Both parties have been losing every election for the last 30 years. Maybe 2008 was the one exception where there was a kind of persuasive victory for the Democrats. But basically, it's been 50-50 for a very long time. And that changes when someone with real political talent helps to frame people's sense of the moment in a way that persuades something more like 60% than 50% of the electorate to say, the we that guy's talking about includes me. And I think that is very often a social issues kind of thing. It's very often, how do you understand your aspirations? How do you understand the country? How do you understand the problems we have? How do you understand what you don't like and what you're against? Both parties have been failing to do that in an effective way for a very long time. But because the elections are so close, neither one of them recognizes that it has been failing for 30 years, because you only really learn that when you lose really badly. And a 50-50 election doesn't feel like losing really badly. You think, I could just do the same thing next time and it'll work. And it's true. It really could work. So when I say I think we're at the end of a phase and we're sort of looking for what the next phase is going to look like, I think what we're looking for is what the next majority party coalition is organized around. And that could come for either party. There's an imaginable way that the Democrats become that party. I think there's a much more imaginable way that Republicans become that party. But what it would take is a leader or a set of leaders with a kind of vision of what people are really looking for. I think that mostly would be about symbolic and social issues. I actually think it usually is. But we haven't found anyone with the capacity to do that just yet. There's an incredible hunger in American society now that is not being met. There's a market demand that no one is meeting. That's true in the culture. It's true in our politics. There's a kind of sense that people want something, and instead what they're being offered is the same thing they've been offered for a long time. In some ways, Trump was very different and did something dramatically new in our politics, but I think it was an exaggerated version of where Republicans had been going for a long time. The Democrats also are kind of living out an exaggerated version of the role they've had in this phase of our politics since about the 1990s. And so this feels to me like a moment that we're going to break out of by virtue of a talented politician finding a way to speak to more than 50% plus one of the country. I don't think that necessarily is going to be a hugely substantive, policy wonkish kind of politician. It's actually not likely, but I do think it's going to be someone who can understand the public's aspirations and worries in this moment in a way that we're not seeing yet in either party. Both the fact that our politics is driven by people who live in two different realities, and the fact that it's not substantive. Generally speaking, the beauty of our system is that by compelling people to be part of broad coalitions, it forces them to be realistic about the world. And when coalitions are not broad, they're not compelled in that way. So the fact that we have 50-50 elections, that majorities are so narrow, means that the marginal people in each coalition have enormous power. And those two groups that live in different worlds are marginal on the left and the right, but they're very, very important. You know, the average House majority in the 20th century was 82 seats. The majority that Republicans now have, and by the way, that the Democrats had last time, is 4 seats. That means that the margins of those parties, which do consist and often consist of people who don't live in the real world, are tremendously important in a way that they normally wouldn't be, and that they wouldn't be in a healthier politics where coalitions are a little broader. than what we've seen. So I think these things are related to one another, and that getting out of a place where these margins are so important is the same challenge as getting out of a place where our politics is tied and incapable of doing anything. And I do think that that requires an argument that is native to the 21st century about problems that people recognize in ways that are appealing, that speak to them. I don't think it's quite right that we're in a place where persuasion doesn't matter. I think we're in a place where persuasion is not being attempted. There are people who are persuadable. I think the parties are actually just wrong about whether it's possible to win bigger majorities than they're winning. And they're stuck in a place where, because things are so close, they're very defensive, very protective of what they have, and they don't want to lose the extremely narrow majority that gives them a chance of barely winning elections now. And so they don't seek out ways to broaden it, because when you broaden your majority, you do run the risk of upsetting the people who are most devoted in your party, and maybe they don't turn out, and maybe they're angry with you. So I think these things are connected. Now, that doesn't mean that it's easy to solve them. I think it means it's harder to solve them. And I do think it means that we run a very real risk of those margins driving our politics into a very dark place. It doesn't take much for political violence to get going in a society as big as ours. You know, what we saw on January 6th of 2021 was a couple hundred people. So, a millionth of our society. It can take even less than that for some crazy person to do a crazy thing that really puts us in a new place, that's much darker and more dangerous than what we've seen. That is definitely a possibility. And, as you say, there are enough people who live in these different worlds, separate worlds from one another, that it absolutely could happen. But I think the question is whether that danger is fundamental and central to the character of this moment, or whether it is marginal in a moment when the margins are unfortunately more important than they ought to be. And I do think it is the latter, but that what it would take is to see that it's possible to really win broader majorities in American politics and drive our politics in a particular direction that allows us again to have a substantive debate about the future of the country. Whatever our politics is about right now, it's not about the future of the country. There are very few people talking about the future as if it's actually going to happen, as if we're actually going to live there. We talk about the future as if it's separated from us in the present by some cataclysmic event. And the question is that party responsible for the fact that we're all about to die, or is this one? And the fact is, life is harder than that. We're not all about to die. We actually have to live in 2050, and we have to do what it's going to take for us to be strong and prosperous and free in that time. And our politics is avoiding that question right now by terrifying itself about the next 5 minutes. I think that won't continue because it's not sustainable, but that's not exactly a way of being hopeful. Maybe it's a little less morose than where I found you, Steve.